Hi folks, let's start our last video now on chapter 7, and we're going to look primarily at conducting and managing the job evaluation process. So you can see there's 5 things that you need to consider when you're conducting and managing that process. And one of the first things we talk about is who conducts the job evaluations. And I mentioned just a little bit earlier that evaluations should be conducted jointly by, if you're in a unionized environment, union and management. Otherwise, if it's non-union, you should get a committee together that it represents most of the jobs that you're going to be evaluating in your company. So if you know you're going to be evaluating line workers, production workers, maybe pharmacists, supervisory jobs, managerial jobs, you should get people from each of the groups that you're going to be evaluating. I'm not saying that when you evaluate a line job, like a production job, only production workers do it, but it would be nice to have people on the committee that know a little bit about many of the jobs that you're going to evaluate, or at least they think to ask the right questions. So I normally would suggest 4 to 6 people for each committee, maybe larger depending on the size of your workforce and the number of employees who hold similar jobs in particular job families. It's always ideal to have a plan in place to communicate the evaluation process, where the committee, things like where the committee is at with the evaluation process. I know when I did this, we usually had lunch and learns for people, or you could do a video update and post it in a password protected company portal like a SharePoint or something to update employees on the progress that you're making, some of the challenges you've had and how you've overcome them. Once jobs are evaluated, you want to make sure that you can apply the results. Some people may fall below the existing salary range or pay band minimum, or maybe they might go above the maximum. So how can you deal with this? Employees who fall below the minimum of the pay range, they need to be given an increase to move them to at least the minimum pay level for that range. If employees are performing well in their current jobs, they are also candidates for promotion, and you need to consider if people are being paid below the minimum of their range, whatever, maybe they should be moving to other pay grades. Maybe people who are being paid over their existing salary range, maybe they are performing well and they should be moved to a higher pay grade level, which might also alleviate the pay band minimum and maximum pay issues. Again, if employees are being paid at levels above the pay range, you may also have to consider reducing their pay. So maybe there is no other job that pay band they can go into, or they shouldn't go into. Maybe their job is appropriate in the pay band that it's in. So sometimes it's unfortunate, but you may have to red circle them, which means their salaries are frozen until any changes that you make in the salary range bring their current pay level back into line with what you're paying people within that range. So we refer to that as red circling. Okay, sometimes, and we discussed this earlier, we might have a merit bonus for them. Maybe we can't give them a merit pay increase, but these candidates might be, in order to keep them motivated, we might say, well, we won't give you a one-time add to pay, a performance increase, but we can give you a merit bonus. So if you perform well, we'll give you a one-time add to pay, but we're not going to increase your pay level permanently, or your base pay permanently. Okay, alternatives to a merit bonus: if you have people who are still above the pay band once their job is evaluated, they're being paid above that pay band that you ultimately put them in as a result of job evaluation. Maybe you can give them some kind of a commission structure of some kind, or I'm not sure. It really depends on the job. Sometimes it happens that people might be a little bit unhappy with the results of the committee and how their job was evaluated and what jobs it evaluates closely to. So if people are unhappy with their job evaluation, this may not be an organizational issue as much as it is an issue for particular employees. So in this case, you may need to have some kind of an appeal process whereby jobs are relooked at, either by the initial committee that did the evaluation, that assessed it, or a more senior review panel, perhaps the manager of HR and other HR specialists, and maybe you might even involve the manager of the area of the people who are appealing the job evaluation, that kind of thing, just to make sure that you had a full understanding of the job to ensure the evaluations are consistent and correct. I know when I had appeals, when my committees had appeals, what we would do is we would give the individual or individuals who were appealing an opportunity to speak to the committee and expand a little bit on their written appeal, what they thought was unfair or wasn't considered. So right then and there, the appeals committee or the people looking at the appeal could ask very specific questions while they had the appellant there. So it really depends, but you should have a process in place to allow for appeals or to review the evaluations that have been assigned to jobs. All jobs should be evaluated as the need arises. So how do we know when we need to update job evaluations? Sometimes if you have recruitment or retention problems, so you can't get well-qualified people at the level that you're paying, you might not have understood the job appropriately or sufficiently. So maybe your retention, maybe people are leaving because you're not paying the job enough. Now that could be, and we said this before in an earlier presentation, it might be that there's nothing wrong with the job evaluation process, but let's say it's a skill that's in short supply or it's a hot market for people with those levels of skill. You might have retention problems that may have nothing to do with job evaluation, but you need to validate that it doesn't have anything to do with job evaluation, right? So you always have to look at those kinds of things to see if it might be an evaluation issue. Sometimes your own employees will provide you with feedback to say, hey, what you're paying is out of line with what the market's paying. You guys better reassess this, right? So sometimes you need to do that, but it might not necessarily be anything that's wrong with the way you've evaluated the job. It might just be a market condition. So sometimes these, under the Pay Equity Act, we referred to this earlier as a permissible difference. So you wouldn't want to go giving people a pay increase based on a job that you're comparing a job to, and saying, well, you're paying this guy, or this job, $50 an hour, so you should pay the other jobs that align up with it point-wise in a similar way the same. If that $50 an hour job is really just a market condition because of a skill shortage, you wouldn't do that. So you have to make sure you understand the Pay Equity Act, what your obligations are, how permissible differences are treated, and when you update job evaluations or when you're looking at your job evaluation process, just make sure you've considered recruitment and retention problems. Now, when to update job evaluations. So when should you do it? Well, there are some signals to indicate the job should be reassessed. All right. Sometimes the job itself changes significantly, right? So maybe there's a change in the level of skill, effort, whether it's mental or physical, responsibility and working conditions, then maybe you need to relook at the job. The issue here is that some reevaluations may not warrant a change in pay grade level, so it's really important to keep the expectations of the employees whose jobs are undergoing reassessment kind of in check, and don't overpromise and underdeliver anything. The strategy of the organization might change. So in other words, when the strategy changes, it's often the case that jobs will be reinvented, restructured, and maybe old ones will go away and new ones will be created. That can happen if the company changes its structure, its business strategy, or even consolidates its business with another. So this is usually a signal that says if new jobs are created or existing ones change, we may need to be mindful of how this is going to impact job responsibilities and the skills we need. There may be signs that the job evaluation system is no longer working effectively. If you notice issues with the current system, it's time to review it. As we said earlier, if you're having problems recruiting or retaining employees, maybe what you're paying isn't in line with the market, or maybe you believe that the market or going rate for their jobs is far more than what you're paying, there may be issues. These can be limited to pay. If in an exit interview, for example, your employees tell you they're leaving because of pay, right? It may mean that there's lack of understanding on the part of the committee of the level of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions of the job, or alternatively, it can be that it's not a job evaluation issue at all, as much as it is that you're not in tune with what the market's paying for that job. So we've already kind of discussed that issue, but just so that you hear it again in case you didn't understand it or you missed it before. Now, there may, in this fourth one, there might be a significant change in the labor market conditions. So maybe there's more challenge attracting people. Maybe demand for people outstrips supply. then maybe you just need to pay more because there's not a lot of people. Sometimes we find this, we're going through it with skilled trades right now. Sometimes we find this with people in high tech or technology related jobs. This may be temporary as well. It might only be a temporary burst in demand. So in this case, there may not be a need to make changes to the job evaluation system. Right? If labor becomes difficult to attract and it's not a market condition, then it's highly likely that it might be a compensation issue and it could be related to job evaluation. So check the skills needed to do the job and how widely held those skills are. If the level of skill required to do the job changed and it's not reflected in your evaluation system, then maybe you do need an updated job description or questionnaire for the committee to reassess. Now, there also might be legislative conditions that require job evaluations to be reviewed. Maybe the government legislative conditions, such as maybe minimum wage. Maybe there may be new pay equity initiatives that might require you to review your job evaluation system. Sometimes it's not necessarily how many points that you've assessed, right? But it's how you translate those points into salary. And you have to make sure, I always say to people in compensation that you shouldn't really be paying so close to minimum wage if you can possibly help it. You should be trying to attract people who will come into your organization because, you don't want to be paying everything at the minimum wage, because then if minimum wage changes, or say some companies decide, as is the case in some companies in Hamilton and even out in Western Canada, some of them are adopting this concept of a living wage. They might decide that, living wage is usually more than minimum wage. So you might then need to adjust. If the minimum wage changes, then everybody's getting this pay increase. And that might send a bad message to a lot of people in the organization. Well, this person's getting a wage increase and I didn't. How come? Sometimes they don't understand the impact that minimum wage has. So it's always a good strategy not to pay at the minimum wage if you can possibly help it. All right. Now, let's do a little bit of a review on the Pay Equity Act here. So we want to look here a little bit at the act itself and some of its a little bit about what it says. So if we look at determining what rules apply, if a company employs fewer than 10 people in Ontario, including part-timers, then the Pay Equity Act doesn't really apply. If your employer is federal, and it also does not apply, but employment equity does apply. So if pay equity applies, then consider if you have fewer than 100 employees or you're a large employer. The difference between these two types of employers is that a pay equity plan posting is a requirement. The Pay Equity Commission says that if you employ under 100 people, you don't need to post your pay equity plan. All right, but you do need to field questions from employees on the plan, right? So you need to tell them the process you followed and its impact on them. If you're a large employer with more than 100 employees, then you do need to post a plan. All right. Now, in either case, whether you post or not, okay, you should make sure that people understand whether or not they're getting pay increases and why they're getting the pay increase. And you should also be prepared to field appeals if people have them. So a person might say, well, you didn't post a plan, but I think I would have been in line for a pay increase. How come? The plan usually only consists of by and large, the female and male dominated job classes that were compared, okay, and what the increase is going to be. But if people have questions on the plan, right, whether it's posted or not, if they're not getting an increase, they might want more information as to why they didn't. So you should be prepared to field those kinds of things. Second, you should also be identifying which jobs are female and which are male job classes. So pay equity assures that female-dominated job classes that compare with male-dominated ones will be paid equitably to those male classes. So a job class is a group of jobs having similar duties, similar qualifications, and similar compensation schedules. Female job classes are those that have at least 60% of employees as female. Females traditionally occupied that class, such as nurses or teachers, and one most people commonly associate with females, such as caregivers, personal support workers, for example. If your company has female-dominated job classes, then compare them to male-dominated job classifications. Male-dominated classes are those where at least 70% of its job holders are male. The third thing you want to do under the Act is establish a body to conduct pay equity. Someone must conduct a pay equity assessment. Typically, that's your HR department. Once it's determined which job classes are male and which are female dominated, the process usually starts with assessors, that's your job evaluation committee, selecting a gender neutral job evaluation system. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the point factor system in a later chapter, but the Hay system is one that's predominantly used in most organizations, but certainly not the only one. Jobs are then assessed under this gender neutral job evaluation system that you've selected. Okay, and it's recommended again that you have a committee to assess the jobs, just to make sure that they are assessed by a committee of impartial evaluators. It's imperative that that evaluation committee understand the evaluation system and receive training to know how to apply it to the jobs. Now, when we look at it's also important to collect job information. We talked about this before. The best way to collect job information is using your position analysis questionnaire or just your questionnaire, right? But to perform the assessment, you should be collecting job on a standard form. Again, I posted a sample in the content area of your course, and you can use that if you want. Take poetic license to it in your organization if you're going to ever collect job information. But notice that it covers job attributes that will allow you to assess skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, which are the 4 compensable factors under pay equity. So, talking about that, we want to compare the jobs. So, jobs will be compared on each of the factors: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. I oftentimes find when I'm running job evaluation committees, I like to have or set up an Excel spreadsheet whereby you might have in one column the job title and or job number, and then you might also have skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. All right, and then you can assign, your job evaluation committee assigns a number of points to each of those 4 compensable factors, and then you have a total number of points scored. I sometimes like to find, well, what jobs, if I use the database features in Excel, what jobs are scoring similar amount of points under skill, under effort, under responsibility, under working conditions, and does that make sense? We refer to that as a sore thumbing process. So does anything stand out to you like a sore thumb? So when I'm comparing jobs, I'm looking to see, is what my job evaluation committee coming out with making sense to me? All right, does it make sense? So I used to do it like that, but again, you can do it however you like. You might not have as many job classifications as we had. We had union, we had non-union, we had multiple unions in my work environment, and it was a huge establishment, so it was a bigger job for us. All right. And a lot of times when we could sort the jobs under each of the compensable factors, or even in terms of total points, it gave us a stronger basis upon which to question our own decisions and to learn more so that we can deal with any discrepancies in the job evaluation process. Now, we should also be checking for permissible differences, and we talked about this earlier. When you check for permissible differences, we consider these things that necessitate pay differences. So I'm not going to compare a female-dominated job class with a male classification that might be equivalent, but the male classes may be paid more because it's a market condition, a shortage, I can't get people. We may have to pay electrical engineers more to get them because it's a skill shortage, say for example. But that doesn't mean that any female job classes that compare to that male-dominated job class need to also be paid what that job class is being paid because it's a skill shortage. So you need to make sure that you identify job classifications whereby female job classifications that compared to it point-wise didn't get an increase. You have to say you didn't get a pay increase because it's a permissible difference. All right. We also need to make sure that we adjust compensation levels. They need to be adjusted, and the Pay Equity Commission gives you some time to adjust the pay levels over time. As we said earlier, in terms of communicating the results of the plan need to be communicated to people. And as we said earlier, if you have less than 100 employees, then it doesn't require that you post a plan, but you do need to address any employee questions on the plan. If you have 100 employees or more, you're considered a large employer, you must post your plan. And then when we talk about maintaining pay equity, again, pay equity is maintained by constantly monitoring the compensation environment, knowing how jobs are changing and how this is going to impact compensation levels. Lastly, we need to adjust compensation. We just talked about the need to do this earlier in terms of maintaining pay equity. But this slide is important because under the Pay Equity Act, it says here that if you post a pay equity plan, you have to make sure that you devote at least 1% of the previous year's payroll toward correcting any pay inequities that you find. So this has to be done every year until all the inequities are corrected. Now, if the 1% isn't sufficient to correct all the inequities that you find you have, then you can do what you can afford to do. So you might want to talk to the Commission about devising a plan to correct your inequities that you see. And if you don't have sufficient money to set aside, contact the Commission, let them know what you have available, and they will work with you to develop a phase-in plan. It's really nice to have them on your side before you post your plan. Even if you don't have to post your plan, it's nice to know that they're on your side and they've agreed or have given you insight and agreed to a phase-in plan to correct any inequities. Now, what I've done for you is I've selected or posted a link in your course. So if you go to the links area under resources, links, you will see there that there is something in your website, your course website, that links you to the Ontario Commission site. If you're outside of Ontario, you might just want to do a Google search to find the Pay Equity Commission that maybe you're in Alberta or British Columbia, but you'll find the site for your province. So you can see what services they offer and resources that they offer to employees as well as employers. So this concludes our second and final video on job evaluation. Have a great day, and don't forget to check what's due this week and next week in your course, and make sure you don't fail to plan for what's coming up. Have a great week, and we'll see you online.